All right, Alexander, let's do an update on what's going on in Ukraine. We had an interesting interview from Putin on the Первый Canal, Russia 1 TV. He gave pretty much the same warning that Dmitry Medvedev gave, and that warning is if the long-range missiles, if they manage to sneak through and hit us, well then we're going to really do some damage. Um, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but pretty much that's the message that he gave out. We have a lot of fog of war with regards to Severodonetsk and what's going on there, but I think this is another. Ukraine is moving towards victory, but it's going to be like the siege of Kharkiv and Ghost of Kiev and Snake Island. It's going to be another one of these, and Kherson, which is a recent one, which I thought the Ukraine military was advancing towards this big victory and this big counteroffensive, and it just fizzled out, and then Russia was kind of drawing them in to just counterattack. Anyway, you can get into that as well, because there is a lot of fog of war there, a lot of different narratives from both sides. And what else do we have? The EU is just crumbling. They're fighting amongst. I was going to say amongst each other, but actually they're fighting with Ukraine. Ukraine is mad at Germany. They're mad at the ambassador is mad at Germany. They're mad at France. They're upset at Hungary. The UK is sending three, from what I understand, three long-range missiles, M270s, which is going to be another game changer. And we got reports from the final thing that I took note of is that we got reports from Der Spiegel in Germany saying that Olaf Scholz does not want to provide a lot of lethal aid to Ukraine, game-changing weapons to Ukraine, because he fears that these weapons will change the trajectory of the war. And this is not a joke. I'm paraphrasing, but this is not a joke. And that Ukraine will have so much success with these weapons that they're going to actually march into Russia. I'm paraphrasing, but that is pretty much what the Der Spiegel article says, according to sources in the German government, that these weapons, if Germany were to provide them, would change the war around in such a drastic way that they don't trust Zelensky, because Zelensky will be so drunk with success that he's going to march into Russia. And Germany is afraid of having their weapons used to invade Russia. This is the narrative from Der Spiegel. I was reading it and I was like, I don't know. Maybe we're in parallel universes. I don't know. Anyway, what's going on?
we are in parallel universes, but one is reality and the other is nonsense. If I can put it like this. I mean, there was actually a very, very good video provided by the Austrian Defense Ministry, which gave a pretty clear picture of the overall military situation in Ukraine, and it essentially tracks ours, not these sort of insane things that you're reading in Der Spiegel. And we've also had strangely enough, a reporter from the Washington Post going to Severodonetsk, saying that the situation there is critical. Ukrainian troops are becoming increasingly demoralized, and that the forces there are on the brink of collapse. The Ukrainian forces there are on the brink of collapse. And of course, Olaf Scholz talking about, he's afraid that Ukraine is going to win. And if you give them more weapons, that they'll march on Moscow. I mean, this is ludicrous stuff. If there are people in Berlin who really believe it, then all I can say is they're living in the land of the fairies. I don't think anybody really believes it. I get the impression, on the contrary, I was reading this even on CNN, that there's now great concern, either that this war is going to drag on, or more realistically, that Russia is winning and that there's going to be a massive debacle, and that is what is really driving the concerns at the moment. And we've had comments from Erdogan, who, after all, he's a NATO member, he probably gets some information, which we don't, that on the contrary, they're now in a state of panic about the situation. Now, let's first start with Severodonetsk. I've been looking at what various people on both sides of the battle are saying. Now, Ukrainian journalists, and I want to stress these are Ukrainian journalists who are there and who support Ukraine in this war, they're not in any way pro-Russian, are saying that there's been no Ukrainian military advance in Severodonetsk. There was a counterattack, but it left Ukraine in control of the same territory that it had previously. It's all linked to a visit by, guess who, Zelensky to the region. So while Zelensky was there, he wasn't in Severodonetsk itself, but he went to Bakhmut, which is a town not very far away, which is the main Ukrainian base in the rear area in northern Donbass. The Ukrainian governor of Lugansk, a man called Gadai, was basically strong-armed by Zelensky's officials to put out this story about the great Ukrainian counterattack in Severodonetsk. And of course, it was then reported by the Ukrainian media, the official media in Ukraine, and was taken up by the Western media. And of course, it's true, except of course it's not. And as you rightly said, it's like the Kharkov counteroffensive, it's like the Kherson counteroffensive, it's like all of these other offensives and counteroffensives that have been taking place that Ukraine has been launching or talking about. It is essentially a media construct. It's not entirely a media construct because Ukrainian soldiers are sent into battle to try to give some credence or reality to these offensives or counteroffensives. But the result is heavy loss of life, massive damage to material, and of course it's going horribly, horribly wrong, and incrementally, steadily, Russia continues to advance. Now, all these stories about, we're not sending all these vast floods of weapons to Ukraine because we don't want Ukraine to win. What those are, in my opinion, is news management. The fact is, they understand that they can't supply lots of weapons to Ukraine. They're running out of weapons, many of the critical weapons to supply. I mean, Scholz actually was talking about supplying some kind of anti-aircraft missiles, except of course it turned out Germany didn't even have those missiles that they were talking about supplying. So there are logistical restrictions, but also I think their commanders, the defense people in the West, are now starting to warn their governments sending these weapon systems to Ukraine is not going to be a game changer. You're going to be over-investing in failure. And there was a long article by a British general in the London Times over the weekend in which he said, sending weapons isn't going to change the picture. Ukraine, to be able to use those weapons effectively, would need a completely different army from the one it has now. It would need different generals, different training systems, different whole operational philosophies, and that would take a long time to carry through. And even then it might not work because, of course, the Russians might escalate. And besides, Ukraine doesn't have that time. So that's what's really going on. But they've come up with this propaganda of success. They have to turn around. They have to explain it away. They can't seem publicly to be admitting that Ukraine is losing. And so they come up with these fanciful and fantastic and indeed ridiculous claims that you see appearing in Der Spiegel. And all the recriminations, all the arguments that you see happening within the European Union are because it's not working. This whole thing isn't working. There is now a debacle emerging. And what I find the most staggering of all is that apparently it's been informally admitted that the European Union is going to continue to import Russian oil, only it's going to do so after buying it from third parties. So it's the whole thing is, it's in the early stages of falling apart, with recriminations now starting to appear, everybody blaming and criticizing everybody else.
Yeah, okay. Comment on the fact that Macron believes that the EU should be kind to Russia and not humiliate Russia and thus provide an off-ramp, an exit ramp so that Russia is not humiliated. This is according to Macron. This is what he told newspapers. I think it's projection, but okay, comment on that. Ukraine wasn't happy. Kaluba actually was upset with Macron because he said that he doesn't want to humiliate Russia. What a bizarre world we live in. And then comment on the oil being resold back to the EU because we had the Indian foreign minister. He was at a conference, Mr. S. Jaishankar, and he was pretty much telling the EU to mind their own business. That was pretty much what he was saying at this conference. But reporters pressed him on the fact that India is really upping their oil imports. I mean, drastically. I mean, it's the number. You look at the numbers, and it's pretty incredible the amount of oil that they're importing from Russia. And the Wall Street Journal and Reuters actually said that there's no way India can really absorb all this oil. It's just a lot, and they know that in their research, they know that India is actually refining the oil at private refineries, and they're exporting it back to the United States. But I believe they're also going to export it back to the European Union. The foreign minister of India said, "No way, we are not." Officially, he's on record saying we are not going to profiteer from Russian oil, and there's a shortage of oil, and you'd have to be crazy to purchase the oil and then resell it. But the Indian, I believe the Indian, I think energy minister, I forgot his name. I believe the energy minister, he came out with a statement and said, look, private refineries, tankers come, tankers go. There's no way for us to really know what's coming and going from these refineries. I think that was a hint to pointing to the fact that, look, yeah, there's going to be exports of this oil, and we know that it's going to the United States, and I would imagine it's going to go to the EU as well. What do you make of those two developments?
Right, let's start with Macron, because you said it's projection. You're absolutely right. It is pure projection. He's not saying we mustn't humiliate Russia, therefore we must be kind to them. What he's saying is we mustn't be humiliated, so please, Russia, be kind to us. That's what he's really saying. I mean, it's exactly the other way around, because up to now, the Russians have shown no interest in any of the proposals that the European Union and the United States have been coming up with. Italy's got this new plan. We've learned that there are now secret discussions or private discussions underway, excluding Ukraine, to try and find some kind of ceasefire or off-ramp, and that they're going on within the US, the EU, Britain apparently is also involved. But of course, the point is, why should the Russians be kind to them? In fact, my impression is that the Russians are very, very angry. So, of course, Macron can't come out openly and say, we're facing a debacle. This is all gone disastrously wrong. Because if he does that, especially in the run-up to legislative elections, parliamentary elections in France, which are due in a few weeks, well, the French people will say, well, you led us into this disaster. Why, if you're now admitting it is a debacle and a disaster, are you still there? You're not popular anyway. We only voted for you for, all kinds of reasons which we've discussed many times in programs before. They couldn't vote for Le Pen, so they voted for Macron. But it's not as if it was a positive vote for Macron. So he knows that. He knows that he can't openly admit that the Western powers, that the EU, that the US, that Britain are facing a debacle. So he talks about, let's not humiliate the Russians, let's actually be kind to them, when in fact what he really means is the reverse. And the Ukrainians know it. And that's one reason why the Ukrainians are so angry, because they are sensing that support for them in Europe is crumbling. Of course, Macron has always been, one of the visible skeptics, but they sense that this is becoming true right across the board. So, the British talking about supplying just 3 multiple rocket launcher vehicles. By the way, Putin was scathing about this. He gave an interview in which he said this simply minimally replaces weapon systems that Ukraine previously had, and they're identical, and they've lost hundreds of these. So these little dribs and drabs are not going to make any difference. But if they do provide them with long-range missile systems and they do hit Russia, and I think by Russia he doesn't just mean Russia, I think he particularly means Crimea, well, then there will be all hell to pay. And he leaves it vague as to what he means. But anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. But all of them, collectively, all the Western powers understand that they are running out of options, that they need to get talks started. But they can't come round and say this openly, but the Ukrainians understand it, and they're getting very angry about it because they feel that this support that they were expecting isn't going to be there at the end of the day. So, the great Ukrainian counteroffensive with the vast armaments pouring in, the reality of that, the prospect of that, is melting away. So that's one. Now, India. I'm going to say what I think here. I think all this has been done. Obviously, the Indian government knows this. Knows exactly what's happening. And I think it's exactly what you say. They're importing vast amounts of oil from Russia. They're refining it. They're re-exporting this Russian oil to the US, which, by the way, I understand is not contrary to sanctions. It doesn't actually violate the letter of the sanctions. I think they're going to be doing that to the EU as well. And I think everybody knows it. And I think the oil and shipping industries, which have obligations to customers that they need to meet, know this as well and have arranged it with each other. I think you're probably finding that, all the big oil companies, they're saying to themselves, where are we going to get this heavy oil, this heavy Russian oil? We need it. We can't buy it any longer directly from the Russians. So we're going to the Indian middleman. And that's what everybody's doing. So the Indians are making money out of this because middlemen always make money out of these kind of things. Indian businesses always make money. And apparently there's now a big argument in the United States about what to do about it. You get the hardliners, the Victoria Nulands and the Blinkens and those people talking about, well, we must threaten India with secondary sanctions. And Treasury, Janet Yellen, is saying, that would be a ludicrous thing to do. That'd be a completely mistaken thing to do. If we do something like that, if we start imposing secondary sanctions on our friends, well, then we've taken leave of our senses. Because firstly, we will antagonize our friends. And secondly, we will make a bad economic situation for ourselves even worse. So that's what's happening there.
Yeah, and even the EU knows it. That's why they came up with this kind of backup plan, which they announced like last week, in case EU countries circumvent the oil embargo, these oil sanctions. Then they're going to put together some sort of tariff, import tariff scheme on oil. They know it. They know it that this oil is going to get sent right back to the EU, but it's going to be sent back at much higher prices. I mean, you just can't cut Russia out.
No, of course you can't cut Russia out. I mean, it is ridiculous. And I mean, they went to, Biden is going cap in hand to the Saudis now. He's going to actually ask them. They said, look,
Venezuela.
But it can't be done. Russia's much too big an exporter for this to work. And the point is, the oil industry has repeatedly explained this to them. Why they decided, the EU, to go for this oil import ban idea, despite all the advice they were getting, including from Janet Yellen, by the way, why they decided to go down this route, heavens only knows. But they did, and the only people who are benefiting, of course, are the Indians, and of course the Russians are not getting as much from their oil as they would if they paid it directly to the Europeans, but they're getting more than enough, and more than they would have done if arrangements had been left as they were, because in a more complex oil market than it needs to be, the middleman does best, the oil producer does okay as well. It's the customer who loses out.
Yeah, going back to Putin's interview and the weapons that the UK is now going to deliver and the HIMARS that the US is going to deliver. My fear in all of this is not that these weapons are going to change the trajectory of the war. I think that's clear. It's not. But my fear is that very much like what happened in Donetsk over the weekend, where Donetsk got shelled. Obviously, and it makes sense. Obviously, there are Ukraine weapons and shelling that does sneak through. The Russians are not going to get everything, and every once in a while something sneaks through and it causes damage. What happens if one of these missiles manages to sneak through and hit, say, Donbass, but more to the point, hit Crimea or hit, say, Belgorod or somewhere up
Yeah,
north
absolutely.
of Kharkov? What happens in that situation? Where does Russia strike? Medvedev
Well,
said decision-making facilities, but he hinted outside of Ukraine. Putin didn't go so far, I believe, in the
no,
interview. I believe he didn't go so
no.
far, but Medvedev did hint at the fact that we know where the decision-making centers are, and they're not in Ukraine, and that's where we could possibly strike.
I don't know what the Russians will do. I would have thought they will strike at the decision-making centres in Kiev, but probably also in Lviv, where I understand that there's a big US command post, advisor post. It's coordinating, a lot of what the Ukrainians are doing. So they could start targeting, Western military people in Ukraine itself. But of course, the danger is that, they could go beyond that and they could start targeting people within NATO, and then we're going to be in a full-scale escalation. And I mean, this is why you should never send these kind of weapons. I mean, they said before the war that they wouldn't send these sort of weapons, but the worse it gets for Ukraine, the more they're escalating. This is the danger. This is what happened in Vietnam. This is what's called mission creep. You say to yourself, you'll only go this far and you won't go beyond. But then you find that going this far isn't enough. You are going to lose if you simply stick to that point. And if you're going to lose, well, that's going to have major political consequences for yourself. So the temptation is always to go a little bit further, to add a few more weapon systems, send in a few more advisors, do what President Kennedy once said about Vietnam. He said, you drink water, you take a glass of water, and then you find it's not enough. And then you drink another, and you drink another and another. And of course, it's not water that we're talking about, it's weapons. And of course, the whole thing has the potential to spiral out of control. And we look at the kind of people who are making the decisions in the West, and we can't be confident that they will eventually draw the line. I mean, people like Ursula in Brussels and Victoria Nuland in the US are not going to, if it looks like Ukraine is about to collapse, they're not going to say, right, well, Ukraine's about to collapse, let's pull back. They're going to say is about to collapse. Let's help them even more. Let's throw in even more of what we can do to try and avert that collapse, because they're totally invested in this project. The media is totally invested in this project, and political leaders in the West are weak and they don't have the capacity to say stop. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. I get the sense that the military in the West, the Pentagon, but also some of the other military staffs in Germany, in Britain, are now beginning to rebel. And they're saying, this thing is getting out of control. But that's a slender reed to place all your hopes on. Let's hope it holds.
All right, we will leave it there. TheDuran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY, get 10% off all merchandise. Take care.